Scripture for the message is from Luke 2, verses 41 to 52. Now Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. When the feast had ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem, searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be doing my Father's work?" And they did not understand the saying which he spoke to them. He went down to them and came with them to Nazareth and was submissive to them. His mother treasured up all these things in her heart. Jesus increased in wisdom, stature, and in favor with God and man. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Do you remember when you were young that it seemed that every adult would ask you, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And your answer, when it wasn't, "I have no clue," usually had something to do with some specific job. And we thought to ourselves, that's my life. That's what it's going to look like when we pictured this job that we were doing. And over the years, we added to that picture. Maybe it was a certain area we wanted to live in, a certain house that we were going to have, and certain possessions, and each one of those possessions would have memories attached to it over the years. That's why for those of us that have lost both of our parents, it felt very odd to have to clean out their house, because it almost seems like you're having to give up some of your life by cleaning those things out of the house. You're saying goodbye to a part of our life. Now, as Christians, though, we're reminded that our life doesn't consist of these things, that jobs and houses and possessions and even family members come and go. But how we share in God's work, that's where our heart and life are called to be. His love and work for all of us is eternal. And so we get to share in that eternal work. So sometimes we have to be reminded that doing our Father's work is what our focus should be in life. That's what our text lifts up for us in this unique text that is Jesus at the age of 12. It's the only account in the New Testament that tells us anything about the time between Jesus' birth on the one hand and when he's 30 and he's coming to be baptized by John. So this is just this one account, and this is it at age 12. And the focus of the text seems to be on his interaction with his family. Joseph and Mary, we're told, went to Jerusalem for the Passover every year. But this year was unusual because Jesus stayed behind after the whole group left to go back to Nazareth, but nobody knew that at first. Now, I've heard various explanations about this. One of them by a church father 1,000 years ago said that men and women in Jesus' day, even though the whole group traveled to Nazareth to Jerusalem and then back, all together, the men and women kind of would be in separate groups. And then a boy at the age of 12, as Jesus was, could have either stayed with the mother and been around her, or could have been off with the men, with the father and others, and that each group just assumed he was with the other one, and so that's why they didn't notice he wasn't there until they had traveled a whole day. To me, another explanation might simply be that the village of Nazareth was very small, but most of them there probably would have come down for the Passover. And so you would have not just your own family, you would have relatives, and maybe there'd be other friends and acquaintances that were out in the countryside, and they all traveled in one big group. So they might have just thought, well, Jesus is with the cousins or with some other kids, and their kids are all off playing together, and as we're traveling back, and so they just didn't see him and didn't think anything was wrong until when they stopped. But the parents are, as Mary says later, pained or grieved to find that he's missing. And like we said, it was a whole day's journey away, so they had immediately turn around a whole nother day and go back, probably search that evening in Jerusalem, and then a whole nother day after that. And we're told after 3 days, they found him in the temple, doing what? Seated in the midst of the teachers, hearing them and inquiring of them. And while everybody seemed to be amazed at this 12-year-old boy's understanding, Mary's reaction, which seems normal to us, is, "Child, why have you done this to us? We're grieved and searching for you." That sounds normal enough. They didn't know if he's alive or not, and so they're looking for him for 3 days. And yet the young Jesus simply says, "Why were you looking for me? Didn't you know that I would be doing my Father's work?" Now, that answer has some different translations you'll see in the English ones. I remember some of the older translations would say, "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" And another one would say, "Didn't you know that I had to be about my Father's business?" There's no noun there, house or business, and sometimes I've translated it as matters. Didn't you know that I had to be about my Father's matters, my Father's work, in other words? And so it seems as if Jesus is saying that I needed to be doing what the Father is doing. And he wanted things to be done at the temple, so that's where I went to, the temple. And so there's questions, there's answers that are going on there at the time. Now, Mary and Joseph, we're told, do not understand this. And yet he does go back to Nazareth until the appointed time, and we'll see in the next chapter, that'll be when John the Baptist, his cousin, will start baptizing in the Jordan, and Jesus will come to be baptized. That's the signal for the appointed time for his ministry to start. But for now, we're told at the end of the text here, he would go back, and there is a home in Nazareth, there's family, there's relatives. But this text that's telling us about the 12 years old at the temple seems to be letting us know already that he already knows that his life doesn't consist of a home and a family and relatives. There's some bigger work of God, a work that's going to bring all of us to come not just to have a house, but to have a heavenly home. To have not just a family here and now, but to have an eternal heavenly family. And that's what the Father's work was, and Jesus was going to spend his life doing that work. And then we, in response, will start to give our lives to share in that work, to try to be a witness to the work that he's done. And that's what constitutes our life here and now, more than possessions or jobs or even families. Let's hear from Sandra Angelo. Sandra had spent many years trying to achieve a certain lifestyle in her adult life. And she finally thought she arrived when she was able to buy a home in an affluent area of San Diego County. She had a very prosperous business for 17 years and was able to run the business out of this home. She had a big art collection. She just had so many different things. And yet, if she were honest, the drive to achieve all of this seemed to leave her a little more cynical than she really liked. And she found herself focusing on the negative a lot, always complaining about the things that are wrong instead of looking to see what was right or what was good that was occurring. Well, she said all of that changed in 2 days, when there were 5 separate wildfires went throughout that county in San Diego and destroyed 2,500 homes, including hers. Well, she was waiting for permission to return to the site from the officials when she met a friend, Paul, at a restaurant. He had offered to help her go back and see what was left of her house. He prayed with her at the table there that God would give her signs to remind her of his love. And when permission was granted, she and many others joined a long line of cars. She said it was almost like a funeral procession. And they were driving through what seemed to be a war zone. Large houses were now ash heaps, with an occasional chimney standing because those were made of brick and stone instead of wood. When they arrived at what was left of Sandra's home, she could only stare at first. But her friend Paul started digging around and trying to see anything that was salvageable. She went to the dryer, or the remnants of it that was still there, and she knew there was an expensive Egyptian cotton towel that had been in there. It was white, but now it was black, and as she tried to pick it up, it disintegrated in her hands. Her art collection, that was 900 pieces, all gone. Nothing left of it. Paul called her over, though he had found something. It was a picture of her dad that was completely intact, and even though the fire had been all around it, the glass in the picture hadn't even broken, and the picture wasn't burnt at all. She said, here was the face of the man who taught me to believe in God. He and her mom had been missionaries with Wycliffe Bible translators. They go to usually very small tribes and remote areas where the Bible hadn't been translated into these tribes' languages. They learn the language of the tribe, they stay and live long enough with them, and then they translate the Bible into that language so that each tribe, every person would have a copy of the Bible. They had gone to the Congo and looked at some smaller tribes there, that in Africa. She said, I watched my father's faith as he survived the loss of our home when soldiers had torched the entire village and slaughtered those who had not escaped. They had only escaped with the clothes on their back and a few photos. Her father's face in the picture seemed to be telling her, your riches are within, not these things that are destroyed around you. Paul called out to her again. He had found her mother's wedding Bible, the one they had used to translate the scriptures into these African languages. After recovering a few other small items, they returned to the restaurant, and Paul was opening that Bible up and trying to find some scriptures that would comfort her when out fell the stack of papers. She said her mom had written these 40 years before, on the very week after they had lost their home in Africa. She wrote encouraging words about how she coped with the devastation that wiped away all her worldly possessions. God had seen to it that I had both my mother and my father on the day I needed them most. Sandra was reminded of their faith and of her faith. In her mind, she heard the verse from 1 Thessalonians, in everything give thanks. This brought about a change for her life. Instead of the cynical drive to achieve, now she felt that she would write down at least 10 things each day that God was already doing, that God was working for the good either in her life or in people around her. And she wouldn't stop until she had 10 things down for each day. She had remembered Psalm 107 with a verse that said that if she could do these things, that would lead her to understand the loving kindness of the Lord. And by the time she had written this story, she had written down 8,342 good things that God was doing around her. God's loving kindness is new every morning, she quoted. And now I know it too. We too are tempted to think that our life consists of jobs or houses or possessions, but all those things come and go in life. God reminds us that sharing in his love and work is where our heart and life are called to be. That's where things will stay the same when everything around us changes. may we be able to say, as the 12-year-old Jesus, you can always find me doing my Father's work.